What's up? Welcome my first guest, Deborah Sawyer, to my show tonight. I'm laughing because my cat is next to me. You can't see it. We're on the radio. My cat keeps headbutting me. Anyway, she's wrote a really interesting book. I'm looking forward to talking to her about it because this year I'm going to be releasing a book. It's a dystopian political thriller. And her book is kind of about the demise of democracy. Right, Deborah?
That is one of the themes. It involves the COVID pandemic.
Yes.
And how that might have had motivations that haven't yet come to light. And I write about what the Chinese Communist Party might have really been doing behind the scenes.
There's so much good stuff here, man. There's so much good stuff. It's nice to have you on here. Going back to the virus, the pandemic, to me, it seemed very scripted. Do you agree? Like it was planned, it was intentional?
I think there were elements of it that didn't make sense if it was a natural virus. Certainly, when you get to the point, there are all these variants showing up. Now, over time, viruses mutate and variants appear, but it doesn't usually happen so rapidly. So there are so many of them in such a short time frame. And also, usually viruses mutate to become less harmful to their host, because if they don't, they kill the host. And so for survival, they need to get to a point of symbiosis. So here we have all these variants coming along that are actually worse, more harmful, more deadly than the original COVID-19. So to me, that suggests it was like a designer virus. It was not just an accident. These things happened. And in my book, at the start, I talk about a couple of what you might call rogue elements of the Chinese Communist Party, sort of who are familiar with work that's being done at the Wuhan Virus Institute, recognizing an opportunity to take one of the viruses that they're doing what's known gain of function research on, where they actually tinker to make the virus more harmful. That's sort of the impetus for the story, how that virus that became COVID-19 was not just a natural accident. And it was possibly not zoonotic, as we've been led to believe.
All of that makes perfect sense. But do you remember when the virus first was out and the Chinese released a bunch of videos? Somehow there were videos from China, but, they don't have internet there. So how it got out, leaked out. Do you remember seeing those videos of like people like stumbling out of their door and collapsing in the street and puking up blood and stuff? Do you remember that?
That I don't remember so much, because my recollection is the Chinese were doing everything they could to sort of suppress information. I mean, the police went after the doctors who blew the whistle and reported this ultra harmful flu that was starting to hurt people. And, journalists who tried to report on it were somehow disappeared. And so, it was just sort of, to me, it was a lot of work being done to hide it. And so maybe those videos were staged. Who knows?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
They were totally fake. Clearly they were fake. But I'm just saying, but they were scare tactics that the media used. Was Big Pharma in cahoots? I mean, if you really think about it, Big Pharma stood to gain the most, and Big Pharma has so much money that they can bribe all of the senators and everyone. And when they pass a bill that mandates all federal workers must get vaccinated, that's a bill that makes Big Pharma billions and billions and billions of dollars. So if they approach them and say, we give you, a $20 million kickback to sign this bill to make sure whatever, and maybe somebody holds their ground and says no. And then when they say, we give you $1 billion, and they break down what $1 billion can do for your family. This is not just for you and your family. This is for you and your extended family for the next 5 generations.
Yeah.
And the person goes, so all I got to do is sign this bill? And they're like, yep, that's it. So they say, yeah, and they sign a bill. Most of these politicians are all bought. And then Big Pharma, who's already got the components of the drug stashed away. Now, I think China was involved because
they were the first ones to sequence the genome.
Right.
Wuhan did that. They were the ones who first cracked that to sort of lay the groundwork for moving forward with solutions. But yeah, it moves very quickly from being pure science into applied science. And that's where, of course, people can make money.
Yeah, they turned it into a business. 400 human souls became billionaires off of Corona. So if they planned this out and executed it, 12, 13, 15 people got in a room, they're in Wuhan, they're in whoever, and there's Big Pharma, senators, Fauci, whatever, and say, listen, if we do this right, we can take a relatively benign virus. It may kill some people, but that's going to be collateral damage, if you will. Most people will recover from it. We can hype it up and scare the whole world using the media. Use images, people falling dead in the street, slabs in Italy, make everybody terrified of this, shut down the whole world, make everybody go home from work, and then come up a miracle vaccine 9 months later or whatever. But they already had it probably. Hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to make it. We're going to make profit from that. And then we sell it back to the government at a massive profit. Then we make them pass laws that mandate that federal workers and school workers and police, everybody who they can force to get it, has to get it, and we can make trillions of dollars. That's my opinion. Do you think I'm wrong? What is your theory?
Well, in Democracide, I talk more about how the Chinese have a goal of remaking the world along Chinese principles. So their motives probably aren't profit motives. They want to subdue and reform, so to speak, the world's democracies because they don't like our systems. They don't like our system of government. I wouldn't like to say it's purer thought than a profit-making thought, but the idea is in Democracide that they realize that if they release this virus, they can cripple the democracies and set the stage for this transformation of the world along Chinese characteristics.
I love that. So how do they do it in your book? Like, what is their approach exactly?
Well, in my book, they've done this work, what they call gain of function research at the lab in Wuhan. And then someone finds a way to use the wet market, as it's known, to start the spread of the virus. So it looks like it's zoonotic or natural. But in actual fact, the idea is that somebody actually did take the virus and go and start this deliberately. And also the two epicenters in the early days of Iran and Italy, there were a lot of people traveling from China to those two places. And the idea is then those Chinese citizens, perhaps unwittingly, were used to go and seed the virus overseas. And so the idea is they've tried to make it look natural. But if you read what the plotters are doing early in the book, this is no accident. This is something they worked on deliberately. And then the story of Democracide goes on from there and the impacts on individual people. It takes place at the same time as the democracy protests in Hong Kong, 2019, 20, and all the rest of it, and how that it served their purpose to suffocate and suppress democracy in Hong Kong because they were able to bring in all these controls because of COVID. So that sort of aided and abetted the plan of the Chinese Communist Party to suppress, civic life and democratic activity in Hong Kong.
Such an evil world, Deborah. It's just evil world that these people are doing this and willing to use us all like pawns. What is their end game? Obviously, America's the number one enemy, right?
Well, the idea is that slowly but surely they would take over more and more of the world. But they're not going to do it with sort of armies. I mean, in North America, I don't know about in the US as much, but in Canada, the country's very compromised, that they've infiltrated our government, our NGOs, universities.
Same here.
They own so much of our real estate. So it's like a multi-pronged attack that they've got the infrastructure there with what they own and what they've infiltrated. Then along comes this sort of agent, this bacteria or this virus or whatever that they're working on to sort of paralyze us, knock us out. And then they can take over because, they know what's going on. We're just sort of sitting ducks unless we become more vigilant, because I do think that we have to become less friendly with them. They're not benign. The whole point of communism is they do want to take over the world and make it all communist. So it's up to us perhaps to become more critical, lessen our dependence on them economically, diversify the whole idea of bringing manufacturing back on shore, all those things. We do have options, but we have to sort of really ramp it up and get going with it. We can't sit and wait for another 10 years.
Well, we won't, though, unfortunately, Deborah. Sadly, our young people are not going to go work in a factory for $15 an hour. They're not. They just won't. They'd rather collect welfare and get a free life or live with their parents. So if you try to bring back the manufacturing of America, who's even going to build the factories?
Well, I don't agree with you, because with automation and robotics and all this technology we have,
that's true.
There are factories being run where there's like maybe 10 workers running a whole factory, and it's machines and it's programmed. So
that's true too.
They go around and make things happen. It depends on the product. I don't think you can generalize, because some products, yes, are very low price points when you sell them, but then that's where you have to get creative as to how they're made.
Yeah.
So that you can do it. And it doesn't mean we have to bring everything back. It's just that we need to make sure we're not so dependent on another country.
Yeah. What is it? 80 or 90% of our pharmaceuticals come from them. I mean, like, dude, all of our drugs come from China. In my book, when China stops trade with us, the economy collapses within 2 weeks and we kill each other fighting over what's left. That's the plan in my book. In your book, what do?
Well, in my book, because when they unleash this virus, they had talked about having collateral damage, meaning their own people in China get affected, but they weren't quite prepared for how extensive that was. And so in my book, because it's about individuals, there's a scientist who goes on the lam from Wuhan, and there's a democracy activist in hiding, and it's their story of how they're surviving and trying to avoid being arrested. And eventually to the protagonist, who happens to be a female hacker. She starts hacking about what the Chinese are really doing behind the scenes, and she finds evidence. Then she has to go on the lam because they're after her. But eventually it is resolved. They do manage to get out of Hong Kong. But it's very difficult to get out of Hong Kong because it's now controlled by the Chinese, the communists. And once upon a time, Hong Kong was kind of like a place you could escape to. But it's no longer that, because their reach has gone through the whole island, through the whole community.
So Hong Kong is now like part of China?
Yeah. It's called a special administrative region. But in the handover was it 1997, they have now been under Chinese rule. And so gradually over the last few years, the erosion of democracy is quite pronounced. They closed the Democratic press. They arrested Jimmy Lai, who was publishing one of the leading democracy publications. People have gone to jail. People have disappeared. It's like a full-on totalitarianist state, whereas once upon a time, Hong Kong was like an extension of a British-style democracy.
Yeah.
So that ties in with this whole idea of COVID being an agent to reduce and destroy democracies.
And it really did. Even the civil freedoms here in America. And it was almost like a communist government. The story is more about the battle for democracy, but using COVID as a weapon to try to destroy it. Yes?
Yes. The idea is that they realize if they can shut Western countries down and people lose freedom of movement and freedom of assembly, which is what happened with COVID. Those are sort of two very important pillars of democracy.
Sure.
Along with things like freedom of speech. And so they managed to essentially destroy the two pillars of freedom of assembly and freedom of movement for the duration of the pandemic. I mean, now we've gone back to it. Or have we? Because so much has changed. We don't seem to have fully got back to where we were before all this happened.
No.
There's been a lot of changes. People's habits got changed, dining out, going to events, all sorts of things. People sort of got out of the way of doing it, and they sort of stopped doing it.
Working at home, right.
Yeah. Don't go to the office. People work from home. It still has the lingering effect, perhaps.
Huge effect. Huge.
Yeah.
Even the kids who suffered through those couple of years of lockdown, they're never going to be the same. They're not the same. They're antisocial. They're all screwed up. It's crazy. And they absolutely took away freedom of speech during the pandemic. I lost my YouTube channel because somebody reported me for giving disinformation regarding the pandemic. Literally all I said, it feels like a scam to me. Boom. I got 3 strikes. They wrote me back 9 months later and said, I'm sorry, after further investigation, we saw that you weren't giving disinformation regarding COVID-19, so here's your channel back. And they took away 1 million views. But I mean, if you were to go on Twitter or Instagram, Facebook, any of these places, you talked against any of this stuff, any of it, you were instantly deleted, banned, silenced, canceled. I mean, you didn't have freedom of speech when it came to COVID.
About COVID itself. We could talk freely still about other things. It hadn't
COVID. I'm saying about COVID.
Yeah.
In terms of COVID, you could not speak free. You said what they wanted you to hear or what their narrative was and nothing else. If you did, you were silenced, you were canceled or deleted or banned or whatever.
Well, in my book, in Democracide, one of the things the scientists hadn't quite got to is the virus itself, a damaging freedom of speech. And so the release of the virus was actually premature. And so that's another theme in the book when they go looking for who maybe pulled the trigger too soon and released it too soon, because they knew it would do away with freedom of movement and they knew it would do away with freedom of assembly. But the idea was the integral part of the virus was when it had been worked on more, would take away freedom of speech, but it came out prematurely. So we were lucky. And that's one of the themes in the book, that we were lucky they hadn't done more work.
How would it take away freedom of speech?
Well, it would have had a neurological element, because remember, COVID was, everybody thought it was respiratory, but it wasn't. It was a blood disease. So the idea is that the scientists were looking at a way to add something to it. So as well as the blood disease, it would have a neurological component. So people would lose the ability to speak.
Oh my God, bro.
But they didn't. Somebody got trigger happy and released it too soon. So that wasn't part of it.
Could you imagine?
Yeah.
Crazy. Yeah. Like you can't talk.
Yeah, that's right.
And then maybe it has a permanent damage or something, though. Like,
Could easily, yeah.
Well, this is just my opinion. Like, I would never take one of those vaccines. Anytime they rush an experimental drug through in 9 months and say, hey, everybody's got a ticket, mandatory, that's scary. Like, I had a real good friend who took the vaccine. He was a nurse, and they made him take it because he worked as a nurse. He took it, and he died 4 days later.
Wow.
Heart attack in his bed. I know of a couple other people. One thing that the government does so well is cover up these type of things. Well, somebody told me, I think it was like an 8,000% jump. 8,000. Think about that. 8,000% jump on unexplainable heart attack death under age 50 since COVID. That
is one of its effects. And that's why they began to realize it's actually a blood disease, or it affects the, cardiovascular system, not just your lungs and respiratory system. So, and it did affect young people. Young people were ending up having heart attacks or strokes because of it. So it does tell you that whatever it was and whatever.
Well, do you think it was the vaccine, or you think it was the virus that had people having heart attacks underneath?
That I don't know, because it's possible somebody could have the disease and be asymptomatic. Yeah. And you give them the vaccine, that could have a negative effect.
Yeah.
I'm not crazy about vaccines, but to me, you never give a vaccine to someone who's already immunocompromised. So somebody's ill, they have something already, you don't give it. But if somebody had COVID and was asymptomatic and they didn't know that, because there wasn't any testing before they gave you the vaccine. Yeah. It could be the combination of the vaccine and the pre-existing condition. I don't know. In Democracide, I don't write as much about those elements, although I do discuss some of the theories around the fact it was blood-borne and it was a blood disease, not respiratory.
Your story is more kind of like you said, it's personalized to this handful of characters who are fighting for democracy against the oppression, or call it the domino effect of communism. So that's the main premise of this whole thing, right?
The characters, sort of, one of them is a democracy activist in Hong Kong, but the other protagonist just happens to be house sitting in Hong Kong, and she sort of gets drawn into this. And that's when she starts using her hacking skills to see if she can find what went on behind the scenes. But then, because she had met a scientist from Wuhan many years before, they are convinced she's an agent, and he gave her the secrets. And so now they're trying to find her to kill her.
Well, it all sounds very tantalizing. I hope everybody checks it out.
The big question is it a conspiracy theory or is it the truth?
Yeah. So tell us, before we go, where they can find the book if you have a website, let them know where that website is. Tell them how they can find you.
Okay. Well, Democracide is available on Amazon in both paperback and ebook formats. My website is deborahcsawyer.com, and it has my 3 novels and their reviews on there. I'm waiting to get more reviews in before I put Democracide up on my website. And I think that just about wraps it up.
Well, Deborah, thank you. It's been a pleasure. You sound like a great author. Actually, I'd love to check out your other books. I'm going to go to your website. And by the way, her website will be listed in the show notes, and this will be on Spotify and all the podcast platforms. So you can look in the show notes, and her website is there, her book there. Make sure to check them out. Make sure to check her out. Okay, boys and girls, we got to take a quick break, but we will be right back.